If there was a better way to live, would you be interested? I'm not trying to say that the way you're living is bad or anything. You know, I mean, a room this size, there's certain to be some people that really got it together. But even for those of you that are really happy with the way you're living and everything is going well, if there was a better way to live, how many of you would be interested? Yeah. Last week, I made a new friend. At least I hope that he would consider me to be a friend. And he told me that he was an atheist, and he knew I was a pastor, so I think that he thought I would be offended by the fact that he was an atheist. And with some obvious exceptions, like people that are, really reactive and kind of hateful, I tend to actually like talking to atheists because they're skeptical and they've asked questions and they tend to have thought things through at a deeper level. And certainly this guy was one of those people. He grew up in the church. He had really done some serious exploration of the Christian tradition and other philosophies. And he just says he's a skeptical person by nature and he just doesn't believe a lot of it. And I said, look, I'm skeptical too. In fact, I started sharing some of my story from college when I studied sociology, and from a sociological perspective, I began to understand that I was a Christian because I grew up in a Christian family in a Christian country. Sociologically speaking, I would be a Muslim if I grew up in a Muslim country, in a Muslim family, or a Hindu, and I realized at that point in my early 20s that I was a Christian just because of those factors. I never really thought it through. I'd never asked questions. And so I stepped away from the identity of being a Christian for a while, and I started studying some other religions and philosophy. And eventually I came back around and I started studying Christianity. And I said to this new friend, I was like, this is what I began to understand religion to be. Religion is just a system of thought designed to deal with the realities of life. And when I started to think about religion, divorced from all the things that you should do and you have to believe, and I just wanted to understand, what was Christianity saying about life? What was its viewpoint? And I began to get interested because as I began to learn what Jesus taught about life, it helped me deal better with my life. And that was my entry point to becoming an adult Christian, somebody that decided to be a disciple of Jesus, because I just began to think about, what is Jesus trying to teach? What's his viewpoint? And does that help? And I said to this new friend, this skeptical atheist friend, I said, look, I'm just looking for the best viewpoint to help me deal with my life in the best possible way. And if somebody could show me a better viewpoint than what Jesus taught, I'm interested. And you might think, whoa, hold on a second, you're like a Christian pastor. Like, aren't you committed to this whole Christianity Jesus thing? And I am, but the reason that I'm committed to it is because as I grow in my understanding of how Jesus sees the world and how he teaches me to see the world and how to see myself, I just tend to think it helps me deal with life better than any other viewpoint that I looked at. And again, if somebody could show me a better viewpoint, I'm all ears, because my commitment is not to a particular viewpoint. My commitment is to the truth. And I just happen to think that Jesus teaches the truth, that he shows us a really truthful, good way to view our lives and the world around us. We're in the 6th week of a sermon series titled The Most Important Story You've Never Been Told. And this story, in some ways, is really just the story of Jesus teaching a better way to live. Now, if you haven't been here in the last couple of weeks, or you missed a few, I'm just going to kind of catch you up with a little bit of the context of this story that Jesus is teaching. And we're going to begin with the people of ancient Israel. And this group of people, they have a covenant, a partnership with God based on a series of promises, and those promises are really around what New Testament scholars call works. They made a covenant with God, the people of ancient Israel, and the covenant was, if they will follow God's laws, you've heard of the 10 Commandments, there's 613, if they will follow those laws, rules, and regulations, do those festivals and all those things, then God will bless them, and if they don't, God won't. And that's the story of the Old Testament, of the Old Covenant. And if you've read any part of it, you would quickly pick up on the fact that they don't do very well of keeping their end of the bargain. And so things start to go bad for them. And after a while, after hundreds of years and many generations, a group of people come along called the prophets, and they begin to write these prophetic takes on the people, or on the story of ancient Israel. You got the prophet Isaiah, the prophet Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Micah, Amos, like all these prophets, and they begin to give this viewpoint about how Israel has failed to keep the covenant. That's tough. But they also have this hopeful view of the future that God is going to do some sort of thing in the future that's going to be a good thing. And some of the prophets, many of them, most of them, they talk about this individual that is referred to as a Messiah, an anointed one. God's going to raise up this special individual that's going to lead the people to this good thing. And the prophet Jeremiah specifically, he says that the good thing that this Messiah is going to lead them to is something called the new covenant. And Jeremiah says this new covenant is not going to be like the old covenant he made with ancient Israel. It's not going to be based on works. It's going to be based on grace. He doesn't use that word, but he describes this unilateral, unconditional, unlimited act of God to forgive all people and bring them close. And he says that no longer will you need to write this covenant down on tablets like they wrote the old covenant, right? You've seen that picture of Moses with the 2 stone tablets. Anybody see the Monty Python depiction of this? Where there's 3, and he drops one, and it's like, we have 15 commandments, 10 commandments, right? But it's not going to be written on stone. It's going to be written where? On your hearts, within you. And all people, not just the special people, all people, from the greatest to the least, all people are going to be invited into this covenant. And when you invite all people, you get crowds. And there's going to be all these people. And so this is the storyline that leads up to Jesus. And we have 4 accounts of the life of Jesus. And we're going to be in Matthew chapter 5 today. And Matthew says this. He says, now when Jesus saw the crowds, he went up on a mountainside and he sat down. And his disciples came to him and he began to teach them. Now before we get into what he taught, I just got to make a simple point. Matthew's just kind of describing what happened, but notice, there's a crowd of people, and what does Jesus do? He climbs up a mountainside. Anybody ever been mountain climbing or like hiking up a mountain, Yeah, like, right? Here's just one point about if you've never hiked up a mountain. It is far easier to walk on a flat path than on a mountainous path. Should I repeat that? Everybody got that? Yeah, right. It's far easier than if you're just going and everything's level and there's no elevation. But if you start trying to go up a mountain, that takes effort. Me, because, I am who I am, I start sweating because, it's like this takes a lot of effort. And so Jesus, he goes up this mountain and his disciples, they follow him. And that takes effort. And only those that are willing to put in the effort get to receive the teaching. And some of you, like you're really interested in being a disciple of Jesus, but it's not really doing a lot for you, if you're to be honest. And you haven't put in the effort to learn his teachings. I mean, you want to believe, but you've never taken the time to try to really understand this is how Jesus says to see the world. This is how Jesus thinks about me. This is how Jesus thinks about others. And these disciples is just like a little tiny point. But, if you want to really gain the teachings of Jesus and you want them to have a profound effect in your life, you got to put in a little effort. You got to go up the mountainside to receive them. Not everybody got this. Only the disciples who are willing to climb. Jesus starts off what ends up being a 3-chapter teaching. It's called the Sermon on the Mount. It's the greatest sermon ever preached. And he starts off this massive, brilliant sermon with this. And you remember high school when you had to write a thesis statement? And if you were good in English, like your thesis statement, everything else fed from that. It was the 1-sentence summary of everything you had to say. Think of this in that way. Here's Jesus' thesis statement. If you want to know the better way to live, and all of you raised your hand, Jesus is saying, I'm going to tell you a better way to live, and it starts with this, and if you can't get anything else, if you don't hear one other thing that I have to say, Jesus is saying, hear this. You ready for it? Some of you already know it. And you're like, why is he making such a big deal out of that? I'm telling you, it's a big deal. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are the poor in spirit. What does that mean? The poor in spirit are the people who embrace their daily dependence on God, regardless of what they have. The poor in spirit are those that realize that life can change in an instant, and that today you woke up because God and God's grace allowed you to wake up, and tomorrow, if you wake up again, it's because of God and God's grace. You recognize that daily you depend on God. And, this is so big because most of the time our lives are in such a way that we don't really think about our daily dependence. Things are just kind of going as they go. And, it's Monday, I got to get up for work. It's a bunch of have-tos and what have you. But then something happens, and it throws all that out the window, and all of a sudden, the fragility of life, the temporary nature of life is pressed upon you in a way that then all of a sudden, you're depending on God. But it's always been the case that you're dependent on God. My dad... at the end of a pretty long career at R.R. Donnelly & Sons, is where he worked in Chicago. In the fall, the company announced a merger. And he had built his tax department and hired all these people. And he got his job to a place where he absolutely loved what he did. He felt, totally geared for it. It's kind of peak of his career. And they announced the merger, and it becomes pretty clear that they're going to change all that up. And he'll still have a job, but it will be a very different job and maybe not a job that he wants. And he's looking at that going, wow, life was going pretty smooth, and then that happened. And he thought, that was going to be the big thing he had to deal with that year. And then one night, he wakes up with a piercing pain in his side. And he ends up going to the hospital, and I was bartending at the time, so I got in really late, and I got a text from Mom. She said, we brought your dad to the hospital, and he has kidney stones. And so I start getting ready for work, and then I get a phone call. It's not kidney stones. He has terminal kidney cancer. The day before, he thought the big issue was, this job that he loved, it was going to change. But now all that went out the window because all of a sudden he discovered that he was incredibly sick and may only have 6 months to live. Thankfully, the surgery was successful. We got 10 more years with Dad. Life can change in an instant. And you know this if you've ever gone through a tragedy. And Jesus is saying, let's just start with the hardest reality of being a person, the fact that things are far more fragile than we would like to admit. And those who are poor in spirit, they embrace their daily dependence on God regardless of what they have. And when they do that, theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Because when you're embracing that dependence on God, all of a sudden you realize that you are in the palm of God's hand, and without God, you might not be here. And so you're in the kingdom of heaven, you're under God's rule. And when you understand how fragile life is, how fleeting it is, you begin to realize how precious it is. And so Jesus is saying, if you hear nothing else from me, let's just start with this cold, hard fact that life can change in an instant. And some of you have stories of a tragedy and you lost somebody, something's happened, and things are out of your control. And let's just start with that, and we're going to invite you to embrace that. Because all of us, we face this gap between what we can do and what is needed. Every single one of us, we experience this with our finances and our relationships, all these places in our life. And Jesus is saying that those who are poor in spirit, they understand that it is by God's grace that the gap gets bridged. Or to put it another way, those who are poor in spirit, they let go of the fantasy of self-sufficiency. And they understand that they are in the palm of God's hand. And if something bad happens, most of us, we start praying. But Jesus is saying, don't wait for something bad to happen. Begin to cultivate this attitude of saying, I'm alive today because of your grace. What am I going to do this afternoon if that bad thing happens? I'm going to rely on your grace. What am I going to do if the good thing happens? I'm going to rely on your grace. I am just reliant on you. I'm dependent on you, and I just embrace that fact. And when you do that, the fear begins to go away. But it's a hard one, isn't it? I mean, I think Jesus is the greatest preacher ever, but I don't know if I would open up with like the most uncomfortable thing about being a human being. But Jesus goes right to it, which is why his second beatitude, he says, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Mourners are people who are emotionally connected to the suffering in their lives and in the world. We tend to want to shut down from the scary things and the bad things. But your emotions, I truly believe your emotions, they are not like the bathroom sink, where there's a hot and a cold, and you can turn off the cold emotions, the sadness and the fear and everything, and still have access to the joy and the goodness and the laughter. Your emotions, they are more like the kitchen sink, where there's one lever. You begin to turn off some of those emotions, those hard ones, the hard things to deal with, and you start to shut down, you're going to shut down from the good things as well. And Jesus is saying, blessed are those who mourn, those that share appropriately the difficulty and the sadness of their lives. They will be comforted. These are the people who are emotionally connected to the suffering in their lives and the world around them. Blessed are the meek or the humble, Jesus says, for they will inherit the earth. People who are humble are people who have a proper value of themselves within the context of God's love and God's creation. To be humble, to be meek, is to properly value yourself. Not to think of yourself too highly, and not to think of yourself too lowly. To put it another way, you are part of God's plan, but you're not the center of it. Think about that for a minute. Right from the first pages of the Bible, God creates humanity. He says that you are good and very good. And he invites us to be stewards of the creation, to be partners in God's plan for this world. You are part of God's plan. The creator of all things, of all the universe, has chosen you individually and the you next to you, but we're just talking about you for the moment, has chosen you to be part of his grand plan, but you are not the center of it. And sometimes, right, all of us, including myself, sometimes we live as if we are the star of the show. All of us do that. But you're not the star of the show. You're part of the show. And that's okay. You get to be part of it. And it's incredibly healthy, because the times when we think that we are the center of it all, these are the times when we're the most fragile and we're the most at risk. Blessed are those, Jesus says, who hunger and thirst for a Coke? Pork chop? What do you think it is? Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for what really can fill you up. Righteousness. Righteousness. Now, whenever I see this, I think of righteousness as this grand level of confronting injustice, like Martin Luther King, we're gonna take on racist society and all these sorts of things. And I think it includes that. But let me just bring it down to something far more subtle, something far more specific for you. Those who hunger for righteousness, they simply understand the link between priorities and fulfillment. They hunger and thirst for right living. We've already established that we are saved by God's grace. That's the new covenant. But even though we're under the new covenant and that gives us the security deep in our hearts, Jesus is saying, from that place of security, from that place of acceptance, you need to hunger and thirst for the right things. Because you understand the link between priorities and fulfillment. Who here likes to watch movies on Netflix or something like that? Everybody, right? If you're not raising your hand, come on. We all you like to relax at the end of the day, sit on the couch, we like to do that. Have you ever done that, but you failed to get all the stuff done that you needed to do that day? Yeah, you have. Now, okay, a smaller portion of the congregation, how many of you have actually gotten everything done that you were supposed to do that day and then sat on the couch and relaxed? A few of you, huh? Yeah, all right. It feels, my wife can't sit down until we got it done. I mean, and she's right, because we know, and Terry over here, you feel great. You understand the link between priorities and fulfillment. And you can watch the greatest show, but if you got a bunch of stuff lingering and you're not doing the right things and you got all this sort of guilt and anxiety about it, you will not even enjoy yourself. And Jesus is saying, look, if you want to live a good life, you got to understand this link. And you got to hunger and thirst for the right things. Some of us, like in American culture, it's so easy just to live for entertainment, materialism, our own sense of self-sufficiency. But right out of the gates, Jesus says, you're not as self-sufficient as you might think. So have the right priorities. If you will put the important things first, if you will deal with that, you will be fulfilled. And if you're struggling with a lack of fulfillment, maybe you don't have your priorities right. My grandma, she used to say, some people, they major in the minors and they minor in the majors. You get that? That's good, isn't it? They major in the minors, the unimportant things in life, that's what they make their priorities, that's what they spend their time doing. And then the truly important things, they minor in them, they give it little attention, and that leads to major issues. And Jesus is saying, look, you want to live a good life, you got to understand what the priorities are. And you could just establish them yourself. Jesus will teach on that. But even your own priorities, you want to be fulfilled, you got to understand that link. He says, blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. There's a link between your own experience of mercy and being merciful to others. Who are the merciful? Merciful are people who maintain a generous attitude in their relationship. I didn't come up with that. I stole that from somebody. I love that. Maintain a generous attitude in your relationships. What does a generous attitude look like? It looks like this. You're willing to see things from the other's point of view. You're slow to take an offense, and you don't gloat over another's shortcoming. You have a generous attitude. It's so easy to only see things from your own point of view. But if you are being humble and you have a proper evaluation of yourself, you understand that other people see things differently. And it takes generosity to extend yourself to try to see things from that other person's point of view. But if you're able to do that, and if you're slow to take offense, you're like, hey, they probably didn't mean anything by that, and there's probably a good reason. And, when they finally realize that they were being a jerk, you don't go, ha, I told you were a jerk. You don't gloat over other people. I mean, I do that sometimes, but you shouldn't do that, You don't gloat over other people's shortcomings. This is a generous attitude. And Jesus is saying, this is what it means to be merciful. And those who show mercy often receive mercy. There's a feedback loop there. But if you're constantly just being stubborn and taking offense all the time and gloating and pointing the finger, you just watch. That's the world you'll live in. And others will respond. And Jesus is saying there's a better way to live. He says, look, blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. And the pure in heart are people who monitor their motivations and manage their motives. That's what I think Jesus is getting at. Blessed are the pure in heart. If you really want to see God, you want to know what is truly righteous, what's truly important, you need to do the work to monitor your motivations and manage your motives. You need to ask the question, why am I doing this really? What is the real drive here? What do I really value here? That internal work, that keeps your heart pure. And if you begin to ask that question, sometimes you'll realize that the reason that you need to just talk to that person and say that thing to them has nothing to do about reconciling that relationship or moving it forward in a positive way. You're just mad. You're just insecure. What are your motives? And how can you manage them in light of God's grace for you? Jesus is saying, if you begin to look at the world this way and you pay attention to staying pure in heart, you'll actually see God. And you know this, mixed motives corrode clarity. And when you have all these different motivations going on, and you're not managing them, and you're not saying, I'm not going to be motivated by that anger, and I'm not going to be motivated by that, it begins to get confusing about how to live. And so Jesus is saying, keep your heart pure. Make sure the things that are motivating you are things that at the end of the day, if you had to step back and go, what do I really, really believe in? What do I really care about? That's the thing that's motivating you. But if you allow a bunch of different motivations to get in there and you're not thinking about it, you're not monitoring your sense of who you are and what to do and who to relate to, it corrodes that clarity. Blessed are the peacemakers, Jesus says, for they will be called children of God. The peacemakers are people who actively seek reconciliation with their enemies and between enemies. You want to know how to be in the world? Jesus is saying you want to know what's important. You want to know what to be committed to? Be a peacemaker, because that makes you part of God's family. Because that is what God is doing, constantly trying to make peace with God's enemies, offering up grace. And so people who are peacemakers are actively, you're not waiting for them to call you, you're making the call. You're not waiting for them to come your way, you're going their way. You're actively seeking reconciliation, repair in the relationship with your enemies. And you're like, I don't have any enemies with your spouse, like whoever it might be. And you're also trying to broker that between other people. And then the last one, Jesus says, blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness. Your hunger and thirst for righteousness, and this leads to suffering. And the persecuted are the people who are people who willingly suffer and sacrifice for what is right. And anybody that's a parent here, you got to sacrifice for what is right. To attend to that kid, you're going to have to get up in the middle of the night when they're young. You're going to have to do all sorts of things. You're going to have to go to that game and go to that recital and all this sort of things. Last year, since she's not here, my daughter Sophie, she had a dance recital. We sat through like 30 different kids doing their dance number, before she did hers for like 2 minutes. And then it was like another hour, But we loved her. And that's not like real suffering, but it was suffering. It was like, oh my gosh, because some of them couldn't dance, okay? They've been in for a year. People who willingly suffer and sacrifice for what is right. Here's a hard truth. You have no choice. You will suffer in this life. Anybody over the age of 10 here, you understand this, right? Life has suffering. You don't have any choice on whether or not you will suffer. Your choice is often why you suffer. And Jesus is saying, make the choice. Suffer for the things that you believe are truly right, are truly just. Hunger and thirst for those things, and be willing to suffer. I'll put all this together for you. This is what a new covenant person is like. Jesus is saying at the beginning of this great sermon. He's saying a new covenant person is God-dependent, emotionally connected, properly valued individuals who have right priorities, a generous attitude, clarity of vision and commitment to reconciliation, and a willingness to sacrifice and suffer. You got that? You want to say it together? Let's try. God-dependent, emotionally connected, properly valued individuals who have right priorities, a generous attitude, clarity of vision, commitment to reconciliation, and a willingness to sacrifice and suffer. Willing to suffer for the right things because they're committed to reconciliation, to repairing relationships with their enemies and between enemies, which takes clarity of vision, a clear understanding of what's motivating you and why. And you have a generous attitude. You're slow to being offended. You're willing to see the other person's point of view. And you do this because you know it's right. You have the right priorities. You've had people not understand your viewpoint and understand where you're coming from, so you understand that other people have a different view. And you're properly valued. You know that you matter deeply. And you're part of God's story, part of God's plan, just not the center of it, and that's okay. And you're emotionally connected to your own suffering. You don't turn off the faucet. You keep it on so you can cry when it's time to cry, and you can laugh when it's time to laugh. You're a full-hearted individual that is able to connect with other people on an emotional level, and it's because you understand that life is fleeting, and therefore it's precious, and every moment matters, and you're here today because God bless you with another day on this planet, and I hope you don't have to have a crisis that teaches you how precious life is so you don't waste time complaining about stuff and focus on other things. Today is a gift, and you are dependent on God, which means you should be incredibly grateful, and you don't need to fear. Because God has you today, and he had you yesterday, and he'll have you tomorrow, and you are fundamentally okay, and you can live life from a place of deep security, and you can open up your life to other people. When you do this, Jesus says this about you. He says, you are then the light of the world. Because there's people out there that their priorities aren't right, and we're not trying to judge them. We just, people are fighting, and they're angry, and they're not fulfilled, and all this is stuff going on. People are wandering in the darkness is the metaphor, and he says that if you can order your life based on these 8 beatitudes, on these ways of looking, it's the better way to live, and other people need it. They need that sense of hope and security and purpose in their life. And if you'll open yourself up to this, you become the light of the world. So, I got a simple application for you. It's homework. Learn the 8 Beatitudes in Matthew 5, verses 3 through 10. Learn the 8 Beatitudes. I mean, if you're compelled at all that how I taught what Jesus taught today may in fact be a better way to live. That it's a system of thought, it's a way of looking at the world that actually will help you live in the world better, that it will deal with the fragility of life, and so when a crisis happens and somebody passes or something happens, that you will know what to do. It won't throw you. But you also won't cut yourself off either because you know how to mourn. And you know that by expressing your grief and sharing it appropriately, there is comfort. That you got your priorities right and you're managing your motives. And it helps you have clarity of vision, be committed to the things that at the end of the day, when all the noise is gone, you're thinking, yeah, I would like to live a life that is based on reconciling people, bringing people to a place of wholeness, both in my relationships and the relationships around me. And so learn the 8 Beatitudes. How many of you have the Bible app? Some of you. You know that you can download a Bible on your phone for free, and if you began to look at these every day, and don't just look at them, it says learn for a reason. Because it's not just memorization, it is beginning to know what Jesus says and how to apply it to your life. The goal, by this time next week, that you, if somebody asks you, what does Jesus say about how to live? You go, well, first you got to be poor in spirit. That means you recognize your daily dependence on God. Let me tell you about why that's so important. You got to be humble, You got to have a proper evaluation of yourself. You are part of God's plan, but you're not the center of it, and that's okay. It's a good place to be. That you can begin to articulate these because they become yours, and that's the point. If you want Jesus' teachings to have power in your life, you got to learn them. Jesus, when confronted by the crowd, he climbed up a mountain. And only those who are willing to put in the effort receive the teaching. Let us pray.